close your eyes and let yourself drift back 380 years to a nation tearing itself apart. England, in the 1600s, was not the composed, measured country you might imagine. It was a kingdom cracking down its center, a place where the very idea of who held power, who answered to whom, was being rewritten in blood and mud and cold winter air. On one side, a king, Charles I, who believed with absolute and unshakable certainty that God had placed the crown upon his head, that no parliament, no court, no army of common men could question him. He ruled by divine right, and he had done so for 17 long, stubborn years without once allowing Parliament to sit. On the other side, a simmering, restless Parliament, lawyers and landowners, merchants and ministers, who had watched royal taxes multiply, who had seen the Church of England drift, dangerously, they believed, toward Rome. Men who feared for their faith, their property, their very right to exist as free-born Englishmen. What does it take for a nation to break? It takes exactly this: a king who will not bend, and a people who will no longer bow. In 1642, the king raised his royal standard at Nottingham. The flag snapped in the August wind, and England was at war with itself. Into this storm stepped a man most of the country had never heard of, a farmer from the Fenlands of Huntingdonshire, a man in his early 40s with a plain face, a rough voice, and a deep, burning conviction that God had worked for him to do. Oliver Cromwell. He had never commanded an army. He had never fought a battle. And yet, within 3 years, he would forge the most disciplined fighting force England had ever seen. The new model army, a force built not on noble birth or inherited rank, but on religious faith, strict training, and cold professional skill. His cavalry, they called the Ironsides, would shatter royalist lines at Marston Moor and at Naseby. His political will would drive the unthinkable act that shook every throne in Europe, the trial and public execution of an anointed king. And when the dust settled, when the republic they called the Commonwealth could not govern itself, Cromwell would do what no man in English history had done before him, and none would do again. He would refuse the crown and rule anyway, as Lord Protector, as in all but name, a dictator. Tonight, we follow his entire journey, from the quiet, muddy fields of his youth, to the roaring chaos of the battlefield, to the silent, flickering candlelight of the room where he signed a king's death warrant. From farmer to soldier to the man who ruled a nation. This is the story of Oliver Cromwell. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. He was born into a world of mud and mist and quiet obligation. The 25th of April, 1600, Huntingdon, England. A market town sitting low on the flat, waterlogged edge of the fens, a place where the ground breathed damp air upward through the reeds, where the horizon was a gray, unbroken line, and where the ambitions of a man rarely stretched beyond the borders of his own fields. Oliver Cromwell entered this world not as a peasant and not as a lord. He was born into the minor gentry, a class that occupied the uncertain middle ground of English society. Men who owned land but labored over its meaning. Men who sat in church pews of modest distinction. Men whose names carried weight in their own small parishes but carried nothing at all in the grand courts of London. His father was Robert Cromwell, a man of moderate standing. His mother was Elizabeth Stuart, a woman of quiet strength whose influence would echo through her son's entire life. Oliver was one of 10 children, the second child and the only son to survive past infancy. Think for a moment about what that means. To be the only boy left standing, in a house full of sisters and the long shadows of brothers who did not live. There is a particular kind of weight that settles onto such a child, a silent pressure, not spoken aloud, but felt in every glance from a mother's eyes, in every handshake from a father who needed his name to continue. He was schooled under Thomas Beard, a man whose influence cannot be overstated. Beard was a Puritan clergyman of fierce conviction. He taught his pupils that history was not the story of kings and their courtly pleasures. It was the story of God's sovereign hand moving through human events, punishing the wicked, elevating the righteous, and using ordinary men as instruments of divine purpose. Young Oliver sat in those lessons and absorbed them like the Fenland soil absorbs rain, slowly, completely, without remainder. He went briefly to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, 1616. He was 17 years old, and Cambridge was not the gleaming institution of refined scholarship one might imagine. It was alive with theological argument. Puritan ideas had taken root there. The question of how a Christian nation should be governed, who held authority before God, whether a king was truly above all earthly judgment. These were not abstract debates. They were live coals, smoldering beneath the surface of every lecture and every evening prayer. But Oliver did not finish his degree. His father died in 1617. He was 18 years old, and suddenly the weight of the family's modest estate fell entirely onto his young shoulders. He returned to Huntingdon, to the fields, to the FENS dot, and so began the long, quiet years. He married Elizabeth Bouncher in 1620, a merchant's daughter from Essex. Their union would prove steady and warm and deeply loyal. She bore him 9 children, several of whom would survive to adulthood and walk beside him through the years of war and power. She was a calm presence in a life that would grow increasingly turbulent. But in those early years of marriage there was no turbulence. There was only the land, the leases, the accounts, the slow, grinding business of managing a small estate in a part of England that the wider world largely forgot existed. He farmed. He managed tenants. He dealt in cattle. He watched the seasons turn over the flat, enormous sky of the Fenlands. And somewhere inside him, something was struggling. Something was wrong. What does a man feel when the life he is living does not match the life he believes he was made for? When the work of each day feels ordinary, and the soul beneath it feels anything. But Oliver Cromwell, in his late 20s and into his 30s, descended into a darkness that he would later describe with startling candor. He suffered. He wrote of it himself in letters that survived the centuries. He spoke of profound spiritual anguish, of a mind that turned on itself in the small hours of the night, of a conviction that he was, in the eyes of God, the chief of sinners. This was not mere melancholy. This was a crisis of the soul, a reckoning. and it was not uncommon among men of deep Puritan conviction. The Puritan faith demanded an intense personal encounter with one's own depravity before salvation could be truly felt. It demanded that a man look inward without flinching, see the darkness there, and then wait, in genuine terror, for the grace of God to break through. Oliver waited, and at some point in the early 1630s, the grace broke through. He emerged from that darkness a changed man. The transformation was not subtle. His faith, which had previously been inherited, absorbed from Beard's schoolroom and his mother's household, became his own. Forged in the fire of private anguish, he became a Calvinist of deep conviction, holding to the doctrine of election, the belief that God had chosen certain souls before the foundation of the world, and that no earthly power, number king, no bishop, no pope, could stand between a man and his Maker's sovereign will. That belief would become the bedrock of everything that followed. He continued to work the land. But now the work had a different texture. The fens were being contested in those years. Wealthy projectors, men backed by royal patents, were draining the great marshes, enclosing common land, destroying the livelihoods of thousands of small farmers and Fenland commoners who had fished and grazed those waters for generations. Cromwell did not merely observe this. He intervened. He became a known voice for the dispossessed. He spoke at meetings. He organized resistance. Local men began to call him Lord of the Fens, not with mockery, but with a kind of rough, grateful recognition that here was a man who would stand in the gap. Here was a man who understood the difference between law written on paper and justice lived in the mud, and justice. For Oliver Cromwell was now entirely inseparable from the will of God, in 1628. He stood for election and entered Parliament for the first time. He was 29 years old, a minor gentleman from the provinces, with mud still notional on his boots, and a faith burning quietly behind his eyes. The Parliament of 1628 was not a peaceful institution. King Charles I was already at war with his own legislature. Charles ruled with a belief in the divine right of kings that was absolute and sincere and utterly impervious to argument. He levied taxes without Parliament's consent. He imprisoned men without trial. He used the Church of England as a tool of royal control, and he elevated bishops who preached obedience to the crown with the same fervor that Puritans preached obedience to God. Cromwell rose to speak in that Parliament. Once, that first session, he is recorded making only one speech, but those who heard it noted the quality of the man. The voice was not elegant. It was not polished. It was raw and earnest, and driven by something that the well-born lawyers and courtiers in that chamber did not entirely understand. It was conviction, not political ambition dressed in the language of principle, but actual burning, unmediated conviction. Charles dissolved Parliament twice. Then he attempted to rule without it entirely. For 11 years, a period historians would call the personal rule, though his opponents called it tyranny. During those silent years, Cromwell returned to the provinces. He farmed, he prayed. He moved briefly to Ely, where he became a farmer of cathedral property and a voice in local disputes over, again, the draining of the fens. His circumstances were modest. There were years when his finances were genuinely precarious. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a powerful man. He was not even yet a particularly well-known man, but those years were not wasted. Every dispute he navigated in the Fenland parishes sharpened his understanding of how power worked and how it failed the ordinary man. Every Puritan sermon he heard reinforced his conviction that England was a nation under divine scrutiny. Every report that filtered down from London about the king's ecclesiastical policies, about the imposition of a new prayer book on Presbyterian Scotland, about the arrests of men who refused to bow to royal religious demands, added another layer of iron to the resolve that was forming, quietly, in the interior of a man the world had not yet noticed. And then, in 1640, the king ran out of money. The Scots had rebelled. War required funds. Funds required Parliament. And Parliament, summoned back into session after 11 years of silence, returned to Westminster with a decade's worth of grievances and no intention of setting them aside. Oliver Cromwell was elected again. For Cambridge this time, he sat once more in that oak-paneled chamber, and the world that was about to be remade did not yet know his name. But the name was about to become impossible to ignore. The long silence was ending. The national crisis that had been building stone by stone, year by year, through royal overreach and Puritan resistance and the grinding injustice of a system that served the crown before it served the people, was about to erupt. And this quiet man from the fens, this farmer of modest means and fierce faith, this son who had buried brothers and mourned a father and wrestled with his own soul in the darkness of the night, was standing precisely at the place where history's tide was about to turn. He did not know what was coming. No man truly does, but he was ready for it in the only way that mattered. He believed with every fiber of his being that God had prepared him for something. He did not yet know what that something was, but he was about to find out. The summer of 1642 arrived not with warmth, but with dread. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a nation before it tears itself in two. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of contentment, but the silence of men who have run out of words and have begun slowly, with trembling and with terrible resolve, to reach instead for weapons. England had been speaking for years, through petitions and pamphlets, through sermons and parliamentary debates, through the scratching of quills on parchment in cold chambers, where men argued about the rights of kings and the sovereignty of God, and the king had not listened. Or rather, he had listened and he had decided that none of it mattered, because he was the king, because his authority came not from the consent of the governed, but from God himself. And if God had placed him there, then who were these men, these merchants and lawyers and Puritan ministers, to tell him otherwise? Charles I was not a stupid man. He was, in many ways, a refined one. He loved art. He spoke with a slight, careful stammer that made him seem, to those who did not know him well, like a man of measured thought. He believed, genuinely and without irony, that to surrender any part of his royal prerogative was not merely a political defeat, but a sin against heaven. And so he had dissolved Parliament. Again and again. He had ruled for 11 years without it, raising money through ancient and dubious means, prosecuting those who refused to pay, imprisoning men without trial. When Parliament was finally forced back into session by the catastrophe of a Scottish rebellion he could not afford to suppress, the men who sat in those oak-paneled benches had not forgotten. They had been keeping a list, and so, in the summer of 1642, after months of negotiation that went nowhere, after demands and counter-demands and the King's attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in the chamber itself, after the Queen had sailed to the continent to sell the crown jewels for weapons, after every bridge between the throne and the legislature had been methodically, furiously burned, Charles I rode to Nottingham, and on the 22nd of August, 1642, he raised his royal standard. The pole was tall, the banner was bright, and the wind, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, blew so hard that the standard almost immediately fell over. A bad omen, men whispered. The King's herald read the proclamation aloud. Most of those assembled struggled to hear it above the gusting. England was at war with itself. Oliver Cromwell heard the news in Cambridge. He was 43 years old. He had spent the better part of 2 decades farming, managing, praying, mourning, sitting in Parliament, and speaking with an urgency that sometimes embarrassed more polished men. He had no military training. He had never commanded so much as a skirmish. He had read about war in the way that educated men of his era read about war, through history, through scripture, through accounts of great continental campaigns. But he had not lived it. He had not smelled it. He had not heard the particular sound a man makes when a musket ball finds him in the open field. So what drove him, then, into the saddle? What convinced this farmer, this man of moderate means and no military pedigree, that he had a role to play in what was coming? The answer, if he were Oliver Cromwell, was not complicated. It was not ambition, though ambition was certainly present. It was not adventure, though the times were extraordinary. It was God. Cromwell believed, with the kind of faith that does not bend in the storm, but rather grows taller against it, that Providence had placed him in this moment, that history was not accident, that the hand of the Almighty moved through the affairs of men, and that when England cried out for deliverance from a tyrannical king who taxed without consent and imprisoned without cause and threatened the Reformed Protestant faith, that Cromwell held more dear than comfort or safety or life itself. God had already prepared the men who would answer. He believed he was one of those men. He intended to prove it. He rode to Huntingdon, and he began to raise a troop of cavalry. And here, in this first act of military creation, you can already see something that sets Cromwell apart from virtually every commander on either side of this war. He did not recruit from the nobility. He did not seek out the sons of great families who came with connections and titles, and the assumption that rank alone conferred authority. He was not interested in social pedigree. He was interested in something far more difficult to manufacture and far more difficult to take away. He wanted men who knew what they were fighting for. He wanted men who loved what they were fighting for. He wrote about this in letters that survive to this day. He wanted, in his own words, men of spirit, men who made some conscience of what they did. Because he reasoned with blunt and unsentimental logic, a man who fights for a cause he believes in will stand when a man who fights merely for pay will run. And so he rode through the villages and the market towns of Cambridgeshire and the surrounding counties, and he spoke to farmers and tradesmen and craftsmen, to men who had sat through long Puritan sermons and felt their hearts contract with the conviction that God required something of them in this hour. He found men who prayed before battle and sang psalms on the march, men who did not drink to excess, who did not plunder the countryside they were supposed to be protecting, who treated their horses well and their weapons with the seriousness of men who understood that those weapons were the instruments of providence. He found, in short, men who were deeply, inconveniently, almost frighteningly serious about what they were doing, and then he did something that no amount of religious conviction could substitute for. He drilled them. He drilled them with a relentlessness that alarmed those who did not yet understand what he was building. The cavalry of the English Civil War was, in the early months of the conflict, a spectacular and chaotic thing. The Royalist horse, under commanders like Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was superb at the charge. They would thunder across a field with a ferocity that broke parliamentary lines again and again in those first terrible engagements. But there was a problem. The Royalist cavalry, having broken the enemy, kept going. They pursued the fleeing men, they scattered, they looted the baggage trains, they followed their horses and their momentum off the field entirely. And by the time the dust settled, they had won the charge and lost the battle, because the infantry left behind had been overwhelmed. Cromwell saw this. He studied it with the methodical intensity of a man who learns from every mistake, including the mistakes of others. He understood that cavalry was only useful if it could be controlled after the charge, if it could rally, if it could turn, reform, and strike again at the precise moment the battle required. And so he drilled his men in exactly this. He demanded that they stop on command, that they reform under fire, that they obey not only when the order was easy, but when every instinct screamed at them to keep riding. He demanded that the discipline of the spirit, that Puritan self-mastery, that constant, grinding suppression of self in service of something greater, translate directly into the discipline of the battlefield. It was in its way a theological argument made with horse flesh and iron. The early skirmishes of the war were not glorious. They were fumbling and cold and frequently confused. Armies got lost. Supplies failed to arrive. Commanders argued. Men deserted. The parliamentary forces, in particular, suffered from the same structural problem that afflicted every volunteer force at the beginning of every war in history. They were enthusiastic without being effective. They believed without being trained. And against a hard-riding Royalist cavalry, particularly in the West and the Midlands, they suffered. The Battle of Edgehill in October of 1642, the first major engagement of the war, was something close to a disaster for Parliament. The cavalry on the parliamentary left flank broke and fled. The Royalists nearly captured the king's own artillery. Only the steadiness of the parliamentary infantry in the center prevented a complete collapse. The result was formally a draw. But in terms of momentum and confidence, the Royalists had won the day. Cromwell was at Edgehill. He watched the parliamentary cavalry crumble. He watched trained men forget everything in the chaos and the smoke and the sound of cannon. And he came away from that field not with despair, but with a kind of cold and clarifying fury. He knew what needed to happen. He knew the kind of soldier Parliament needed, and he spent the following months building exactly that. Troop by troop, drill by drill, prayer by prayer, through the flat lands and market towns of East Anglia, assembling a force that was unlike anything England had yet seen in this war. They called the region his Eastern Association, a coalition of counties: Cambridge, Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk, Hertford, that pooled resources and men and came increasingly under Cromwell's organizational and military authority. By 1643, he was a colonel. By 1644, he would be a lieutenant general. The rank climbed because the results demanded it. Wherever his cavalry rode, they held. They struck and reformed. They followed orders in the din of battle when other horses scattered. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from fighting, but from watching the same mistakes repeat themselves, from watching men send brave soldiers into positions that cannot be held, under commanders who hold their rank not because they earned it, but because of the family they were born into. Oliver Cromwell had watched this for 2 years. He had watched it from horseback, from muddy encampments, from smoky rooms where generals argued and accomplished nothing. And by the winter of 1644, he had seen enough. What does a soldier do when the institution he serves is broken at its foundation? He brings it before the men who have authority to change it, and he speaks plainly, and he does not stop speaking until something shifts. This is what Cromwell did. He brought his grievances to Parliament. He named names. He pointed at the structural rot with that plain, unadorned directness that made powerful men uncomfortable and ordinary soldiers love him. The problem was the Earl of Manchester. Edward Montague, the second Earl of Manchester, was the commanding general of the Parliamentary Eastern Association Army. Manchester was not incompetent, exactly, but he was cautious. And in a war that had already lasted too long, caution had become indistinguishable from cowardice. After the Battle of Newbury in October of 1644, where parliamentary forces had held a clear advantage and yet failed to press it, Cromwell went to Parliament and made his case. He accused Manchester of deliberately avoiding victory. The words were precise and damning. Manchester responded in kind, accusing Cromwell of insubordination and dangerous religious opinions. Parliament, exhausted by years of inconclusive warfare, found itself willing to consider something radical. The solution came in 2 parts. The first was the self-denying ordinance passed in the spring of 1645. It required all members of Parliament to resign from their military commands. No more earls directing cavalry because their title demanded deference. The army would be led by men chosen for their ability to fight, not for their genealogy. Cromwell was technically subject to this ordinance, but exceptions were made, because no one who looked honestly at the parliamentary war effort could afford to remove the one man whose cavalry had never broken. The second part was the new model army itself, formally established in February of 1645. It was a national army, not a collection of regional forces perpetually squabbling over supply. It was funded by Parliament directly, given standardized equipment and unified command. Sir Thomas Fairfax was named commander, and beneath Fairfax, commanding the cavalry, was Oliver Cromwell. The army was built on the foundation Cromwell had spent 2 years constructing in miniature. The soldiers were chosen for their character as much as their physical capacity. Religious conviction was not merely tolerated, it was expected. The camps were notably different from those of other forces. Drinking and looting were suppressed. There were sermons. There were prayers. There were regimental debates about scripture that would have astonished a royalist officer peering through a hedge at the enemy encampment. This was the army that would end the war, and it would do so at a village in Northamptonshire, on a ridge of ground above a valley, in June of 1645. The village was called Naseby. The morning of the 14th was cool and damp. The Parliamentary Army, approximately 14,000 men, faced a royalist force of around 9,000 under King Charles himself and Prince Rupert of the Rhine. The king had overruled Rupert's caution and sought the engagement himself. It was the kind of decision that defines the moment when history turned. The battle began badly for neither side, and then, with the speed that characterized cavalry engagements, went terribly for the Royalists on their left flank. Cromwell led the parliamentary right wing, approximately 3,500 horse, against the Royalist left under Sir Marmaduke Langdale. The charge was controlled and devastating. Langdale's cavalry broke. And here the difference between Cromwell's army and every other cavalry force of the era became decisive. Other cavalry, once they had broken the enemy before them, would pursue, galloping off the field entirely. This is what Prince Rupert's cavalry did on the other flank, crashing through the parliamentary left and then continuing on to plunder the baggage train, removing themselves entirely from the battle. Cromwell's cavalry did not pursue. They halted. They reformed. They turned inward. They fell upon the Royalist infantry from the rear with fresh horses and full discipline, and the conviction that God had arranged this moment and expected them to use it correctly. The Royalist infantry dissolved. By early afternoon it was over. The king's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Around 5,000 Royalist soldiers were taken prisoner. The war, in any meaningful military sense, was finished on that ridge on the 14th of June, 1640-5. But the most consequential thing found on that battlefield was not a broken pike or an abandoned cannon. It was a box, a locked box recovered from the king's baggage train. The box contained the king's personal correspondence, letters to his wife Henrietta Maria in France, letters discussing the possibility of bringing an Irish Catholic army to England, letters that revealed, in the king's own handwriting, the extent of his negotiations with foreign powers. When Parliament published these letters, the effect was profound. Charles had spent years insisting his connections to Catholic powers were purely diplomatic. The letters said otherwise, not in blunt terms, but in the accumulated weight of a man writing to his wife and his allies. The shape of his actual intentions became visible. The trust that might have enabled a negotiated settlement cracked further under the disclosure. Charles had not been captured at Naseby. He fled and spent months maneuvering, attempting to play Parliament against the Scottish Covenanters. He surrendered to the Scottish army at Newark in May of 1646 and was held by them nearly a year before they handed him to English parliamentary commissioners at Newcastle in February of 1647. The Scots accepted £400,000 in back pay for their army and departed. The word sold is not a metaphor, and now the war was over. And now the complications truly began. The new model army had not merely won a war. It had developed, in the course of winning it, a set of collective convictions about what the victory was for. The soldiers had opinions. The junior officers had opinions. They had been encouraged within their regimental culture to think of themselves as participants in a godly enterprise, rather than hired instruments of a parliamentary faction. Parliament discovered this when it attempted to disband the army without settling considerable arrears of pay. The soldiers refused to disband. Within the army, a group called the agitators emerged, representatives elected by common soldiers to articulate their grievances. They produced documents of remarkable sophistication, arguing not merely for back pay, but for constitutional principle, freedom of conscience, the rights of ordinary Englishmen before the law. And Cromwell, riding among them, listening, praying with them, debating through long evenings in army councils, found himself once again in the position he always occupied, too radical for the conservative parliamentarians and too restrained for the most extreme reformers in his own ranks. He had won the war. He had shattered the king's armies and exposed the king's secret ambitions, and handed Parliament a victory no one in 1642 would have believed possible. But the peace was proving harder than the fighting. The army was a power. Parliament was a power. The king, defeated and captive and still negotiating, remained a power. And somewhere in the middle of all of it stood a man from the fens, not yet knowing what the next years would require, only knowing with the certainty that had always anchored him that God was not finished with England, and God was not finished with Oliver Cromwell. The autumn of 1647 deepened around the army encampments, and the debates grew longer. At a church in Putney, on the south bank of the Thames, representatives of the army and the agitators met to argue out the future of England. They called these the Putney debates, and they were unlike anything that had occurred in European political life. Common soldiers argued for universal manhood suffrage. Officers argued for a reformed parliament elected by property owners. Cromwell sat at the center, listening, questioning, pressing for consensus where no consensus existed, worried always that too radical a resolution would fracture the army and hand the king the opening he needed. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone in that church, that the army's unity was the only real check on chaos. And he was not wrong. While they debated in Putney, Charles escaped from Hampton Court and fled to the Isle of Wight. The debates ended. The next phase began. The army would have to be used again, and Cromwell would have to decide, in the months ahead, what he truly believed about a king who could not be trusted and could not be allowed to remain at the center of every negotiation, like a splinter that infected every wound it touched. The Isle of Wight sits in the cold, gray waters of the Solent, separated from the English mainland by a narrow channel that feels in winter far wider than it truly is. Charles had fled there believing he would find sympathy, believing the governor of Carisbrooke Castle, Colonel Robert Hammond, would shelter him. He was wrong. Hammond was a parliamentary man, and so the king, who had once ruled 3 kingdoms from the grandeur of Whitehall, now found himself confined within the damp stone walls of a castle on an island, receiving visitors, writing letters, and doing what he had always done, negotiating, playing both sides. He signed a secret treaty with the Scots in December of 1647, an agreement buried beneath the floor of the castle, known when discovered as the engagement. He promised them Presbyterianism for 3 years in exchange for a Scottish army crossing into England to fight on his behalf. He had promised war, and war came. The Second Civil War broke out in the spring of 1648, from several directions at once. Royalist risings in Wales, in Kent, in Essex, and in July, a Scottish force under the Duke of Hamilton crossed the border, moving south through Cumberland and Westmoreland, an army of perhaps 12,000 men. Cromwell, who had spent the early months suppressing the Welsh rising at Pembroke Castle, now marched north with extraordinary speed. He had perhaps 8,500 soldiers, and his own absolute confidence that God directed his path. He met Hamilton at Preston, in Lancashire, on the 17th of August, 1648. What followed was less a pitched battle than a relentless, grinding pursuit. Cromwell struck the Scottish column on its flank as it stretched southward along the roads, catching it, divided. Over 3 days of fighting across the wet Lancashire lanes and fields, the Scottish army was broken apart. Hamilton himself was taken prisoner. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured, some of them later shipped to work as indentured labor in the Barbados and the American colonies. Preston changed Cromwell in a way that even Naseby had not. Because this time the enemy had not been misguided, Englishmen loyal to a misguided cause. This time the enemy had been invited. Charles, confined on his island, had sent letters to foreign powers, made secret promises, encouraged men to die in a war he himself had engineered while appearing to negotiate peace. Men had died on both sides. Good men, godly men. Cromwell wrote to a friend after Preston, and the language of the letter is cold and clear. He called Charles that man of blood. It was a term with weight, drawn from the Old Testament, used for those whose hands were stained with violence for which atonement must be made. Not a political opponent, a man of blood. The theology was becoming the verdict. The army demanded justice. That word spoken in army camps and prayer meetings meant something specific and unprecedented. It meant trying the king. Henry Ireton, Cromwell's own son-in-law, cold and systematic, built the legal and political argument. Parliament was still filled with men who recoiled from the idea. Men who believed that an anointed monarch could not be tried by his own subjects. That to try Charles was to tear apart the fabric of the Constitution itself, and so the army acted. On the 1st of December, 1648, soldiers brought Charles from the Isle of Wight to Hurst Castle on the mainland, a fortress of dark stone on a shingle spit, cold and inhospitable. And then on the 6th of December, a colonel of horse named Thomas Pride stood at the door of the House of Commons with a list of names and a regiment of soldiers at his back. Those whose names were on the list were turned away, some of them arrested. Roughly 140 members were excluded. Those who remained, perhaps 60 or 70 men at most, would come to be known as the Rump Parliament. It was this remnant, this thin fraction of the representative body of the English nation, that would now do what the army required of it. Cromwell was not at Westminster when the purge occurred. What is certain is that when he arrived in London the following day, he did not condemn it. He accepted it. He said that since it was done, and since he was convinced of the justice of what must follow, he would endeavor to make the best of it. Not the initiator, but the one who, once the threshold was crossed, walked through without hesitation. The High Court of Justice was established by the Rump on the 1st day of January, 1649. 135 commissioners were appointed to sit in judgment. Fewer than half ever attended. Fairfax, the commander of the army, refused to serve. Westminster Hall is one of the oldest and largest buildings in England. Its vast hammer-beam roof soaring over a floor that had for centuries hosted coronation feasts and high ceremony. Now it was dressed for something it had never been dressed for before: a court, a dock, a king standing trial for his life. Charles was brought in on the 20th of January, 1649. He was 48 years old, slightly built, his pointed beard now grayer than it had been, dressed in black. He did not remove his hat, a deliberate act of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the authority of the court. He would never remove that hat. Not once in all the days the trial lasted. John Bradshaw, the president of the court, read the charge. It accused Charles Stuart of having levied war against his own Parliament and people, of being the principal author of a wicked design to overthrow the rights and liberties of the nation, of having caused the death of many thousands of people. Charles's response was to challenge the court's jurisdiction. By what authority, he asked, was he brought here? He asked it again and again. He said there was no court in England with the authority to try a king. The king was the source of law. How could the source of law be subject to it? It was, in its way, a coherent argument, and the court could not answer it directly, because the honest answer was that there was no traditional legal basis for what they were doing. They were creating the basis as they went, writing the law in the act of applying it, doing something that had never been done, and doing it in the full knowledge that Europe was watching, that the Queen of England was in exile in Paris, that the crowned heads of the continent understood with perfect clarity what was happening in that cold, stone-halled-out Cromwell sat among the commissioners. He sat there day after day as Bradshaw read the charge and Charles refused to plead. Behind closed doors, in the meetings between sessions, Cromwell was the engine. He pushed, he persuaded. He argued with those who wavered. He was done with patience. He was done with negotiation. He had made his decision. God had made it clear. What did it cost him? Here was a man raised in the gentle traditions of English country life, baptized in the church, who had always believed in law and parliament and the customs of the realm. A man who had fought for those customs against a king who violated them, and now he was preparing to do something that violated every custom more completely than Charles had ever done: to kill a king. Not in battle, in law, in public, with a piece of paper signed in his own hand. The signing of the death warrant took place on the 27th of January, 1649. 59 commissioners signed it. The atmosphere in the room was solemn and strange. Some men signed quickly. Some hesitated and were urged on. Cromwell signed third among the regicides. He is said to have wiped ink from his pen onto the face of the man standing next to him. Henry Martin, who wiped ink onto Cromwell in return, the absurd and dissonant detail of two men exchanging a brief, irreverent gesture while signing a king's death warrant, as though the enormity of the act required some small human release, some acknowledgement that they were, after all, only mortal men doing a thing that kings had once considered impossible. The 30th of January, 1649, was bitterly cold. The sky above Whitehall was pale and hard. A scaffold had been constructed outside the banqueting house, the great building designed by Inigo Jones, its ceiling painted by Rubens with images of a king ascending to heaven. Charles was brought through a window of that building and onto the scaffold. He was permitted to speak. He said that he was dying a martyr for his people. He said he forgave his enemies. He said he was going from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown. He removed his own hair and tucked it under a white satin cap, baring his neck. He asked the executioner to wait for his signal. He knelt. He prayed. He stretched out his hands. And then it was done. A single blow, the crowd gathered in Whitehall let out a sound that no one who heard it ever forgot. A long, low groan. Not a cheer, not a celebration, a sound like a wound opening. England had never heard a sound like it. Europe had never seen what England had just done. The crowned heads of the continent looked at that scaffold and understood that something had changed in the world. Not just a king had died, a principle had died. The principle that kings were untouchable, that power descended from God through anointed monarchs without obligation to answer to the governed. It had died in the cold air of Whitehall on a Tuesday afternoon in the 48th year of Oliver Cromwell's life. And Cromwell, somewhere in the city that day, carrying whatever it was he carried inside him, moved forward, because that was the only direction he had ever known. Forward, into the next thing, into the next question, into the deepening weight of a life that grew stranger and heavier with every year that passed. England, in the early weeks of 1649, was a country that had done something no country had done before. It had tried its king. It had convicted him. It had killed him. And now it had to figure out what came next. There was no manual for this, no precedent to reach for. The monarchies of Europe watched from across the channel with something between horror and fascination, waiting to see what happened to a nation that had cut off its own head. What emerged from those first raw weeks was called the Commonwealth. A republic, in theory, a government of parliament without a king, without a House of Lords, which had been abolished in February of that same year. England was to be governed by the elected representatives of its people. That was the idea. That was the dream. And like most dreams, it met the hard light of morning very quickly, because the Commonwealth was born surrounded by enemies. Ireland, to the west, was in open revolt. The Catholic Confederate alliance still held much of the island, and the royalist forces loyal to the dead king's son, the young Charles, who now called himself Charles II, had allied with them. Scotland, to the north, had already proclaimed Charles II as their king. And across Europe, every royal court had harbored a Stuart exile was a potential source of invasion, of conspiracy, of hired blades in the night. The Commonwealth Parliament, newly formed, newly fragile, looked around at the circle of threats closing in upon it. And they turned to the man they always turned to. They turned to Oliver Cromwell, 50 years old now, or very nearly, a man whose face had been worn by years of war and grief and responsibility into something harder than it had once been. He had not softened with age. He had calcified. And the first place Parliament sent him was the one that would follow his name like a shadow for as long as history lasted. They sent him to Ireland. The Irish campaign of 1649 to 1650 was one of the darkest passages of Cromwell's life. He crossed to Ireland in August with an army of 12,000 men and moved through the country with a ferocity that shocked even those accustomed to the violence of civil war. The siege of Drogheda, In September of 1649 was the event that defined it. The garrison was killed. Civilians and Catholic clergy died in the assault and its aftermath. Cromwell, in his letters to Parliament, described it without apology. He framed it as the righteous judgment of God upon those who had persecuted Protestant settlers, a necessary terror so severe that other towns would choose surrender over resistance. Wexford fell the following month with similar devastation. The pattern was deliberate. Cromwell intended the violence to speak before his army arrived at the next garrison. He intended fear to do the work that cannon and musket would otherwise have to do. What is certain is that the Irish campaign was militarily effective. By May of 1650, organized resistance had been broken. Cromwell had subdued Ireland in 9 months, a campaign of staggering speed. The human cost in Irish lives to disease, famine, and violence in the years that followed was catastrophic. The land confiscations displaced enormous numbers of the Catholic Irish population. The wounds cut so deeply into the Irish national memory that they have never fully healed. He returned to England in May of 1650 to find the northern threat had grown sharper. Scotland had invited Charles II to come north and claim his crown. He had arrived, signed the covenant the Scots demanded, and now stood at the head of a Scottish army. The threat was no longer theoretical. There was a crowned king on the island of Britain. Cromwell crossed the border into Scotland with 16,000 men in June of 1650. The Scottish commander, David Leslie, was no fool. He refused pitched battle, fell back, harried supply lines, waited. The English army began to suffer. Provisions ran short. Disease moved through the camps. By August, Cromwell had been forced to retreat toward the coast, toward Dunbar, where his fleet could resupply him. The situation looked, to any outside observer, extremely dangerous. On the 1st of September, Leslie's army of 22,000 descended from the hills and took position on the ridge above Dunbar. They had Cromwell trapped, or so they believed. The sea behind him, the hills in front, a larger army holding the high ground. But that night, Cromwell studied the Scottish positions carefully. He watched, and what he noticed was that Leslie, under pressure from the Presbyterian ministers traveling with the army who wanted the battle joined immediately, had begun to move his forces down from the ridge into the lower ground. The Scots were abandoning their advantage. Before dawn on the 3rd of September, in the gray dark before the sun came up over the North Sea, Cromwell struck. The English cavalry hit the Scottish right flank with sudden violence, and it collapsed. The infantry followed. In the space of a single morning, Leslie's army was shattered. 3,000 Scottish soldiers died. 10,000 were taken prisoner. The English losses were remarkably small. Cromwell, riding through the field as the sun finally rose over Dunbar, was heard to say, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered." He wept as he always wept after battles. Then he wrote to Parliament, and the letter was exultant. It was the language of a man who believed God had reached into a nearly hopeless situation and turned it around. Edinburgh fell. The Scottish lowlands submitted. Charles II retreated north, then led his army south into England the following summer in a bold and desperate gamble. Cromwell let him come, then struck at Worcester in September of 1651 with overwhelming force. The Royalist army was obliterated. Charles, 21 years old and running for his life, hid in an oak tree while parliamentary cavalry searched the roads below him. He escaped to France. It would be 9 years before he saw England again. The external threats were subdued. The wars were over, and Oliver Cromwell came home to a parliament that had been sitting, in one form or another, since 1640. The Rump Parliament, remnant of Pride's purge, had become something that frustrated him deeply. A body of men more interested in perpetuating their own power than in reforming the nation. Bills introduced and allowed to wither. Electoral reform endlessly deferred. A body that had declared itself the voice of the English people, but seemed concerned primarily with ensuring its own members, remained in office indefinitely. He wrestled with this through 1651 and 1652. He met with officers, presented proposals, asked, requested, demanded reform. He was told it would come. It did not come. By the spring of 1653, his patience had ended. On the morning of the 19th of April, 1653, Cromwell attended the House of Commons dressed plainly, as an ordinary member. Parliament was debating a bill that would effectively allow its current members to select their own replacements, a self-perpetuating arrangement that Cromwell regarded as the final proof of institutional decay. He sat. He listened. Then he stood. He began to speak, and as he spoke, his voice changed. The measured parliamentary tone fell away. He paced. He pointed. He told them they were no parliament. He told them the Lord had done with them. He named individual corruptions to members' faces. Then he turned to the door and called in the musketeers, who had been waiting in the lobby. His soldiers walked into the House of Commons. Cromwell picked up the ceremonial mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority, and handed it to one of his officers with words that have been remembered ever since. "What shall we do with this bauble?" "Take it away." The members filed out. Some walked quickly, some slowly, some in stunned silence. The chamber emptied. The doors were locked. The Rump Parliament ceased to exist on the afternoon of the 19th of April, 1653. Oliver Cromwell, who had fought for Parliament against the King, who had signed the King's death warrant in defense of Parliament's authority, had dissolved Parliament by force. In 20 minutes, with musketeers and a handful of words, outside the locked chamber, London went about its afternoon. Traders moved through the streets, horses clattered on cobblestones. A thin rain had begun to fall over the Thames. And yet, beneath the ordinary surface of the city, something was moving. A murmur that moved from tavern to counting-house to printing press, a question with no ready answer. Who governs England now? Not a king. Not any longer a parliament. Something else. Something that did not yet have a proper name. What had he become? He was not yet sure. The men around him were not sure. England was not sure. But something had shifted again, as it had shifted on every major turn of this extraordinary life, and the direction of that shift was becoming, even if no one could yet name it clearly, uncomfortably apparent. The man who had ended a king was beginning, in the minds of those who watched him, to look very much like a king himself. They offered him a crown. It was the spring of 1657, and the men of the humble petition and advice had decided that England needed a king again. Not Charles Stuart, the exiled young man haunting European courts with his claims and his grudges. A different king, a Protestant king, a king who had proven himself on battlefield and in council. They wanted Oliver Cromwell to take the crown, to restore the ancient certainty of hereditary monarchy. Now wearing a godly face, he held the petition for weeks. What does a man do when offered the one thing the world assumes he wants? When every rumor, every pamphlet pressed in secret, every anxious face in a foreign court had drawn the same conclusion, that he was a king in all but name, he prays, he wrestles, he delays, and then, on the 8th of May, 1657, he declines. The refusal was not simple modesty. What troubled him was something theologically precise. He had always understood his authority as proceeding from God through providence, from victories given to him, paths opened, signs made plain in battle after battle. To take a hereditary crown was to place human succession above divine appointment. To say that his son Richard, quiet, gentle, thoroughly unmilitary Richard, would rule England not because God had chosen him, but because he had the right blood. And that, to a man who had spent 20 years reading Providence as a map, was a step too far. He refused the crown. And then he accepted everything else. Under the terms of the same humble petition and advice, Cromwell was confirmed as Lord Protector with powers so broad, so resembling royal authority in every dimension, that the distinction between king and protector had become largely ceremonial. He could name his own successor. He sat on a throne. He was addressed as His Highness. He was reinstalled on the 26th of June, 1657, at Westminster Hall. In a ritual so close to a coronation, the purple robe, the sword of state, the golden scepter laid in his hand, that observers could be forgiven for not understanding what word was missing. The word was crown. Everything else was present. The England over which he presided was governed with a thoroughness no previous ruler had managed. He divided the country into 11 regions and placed over each a major general, a man of military character and Puritan conviction, tasked with maintaining order and suppressing vice. They closed alehouses. They regulated Sabbath observance. They watched the movements of known royalists. The Puritanism Cromwell imposed was not a performance. He believed it. Christmas was suppressed. The theaters remained closed. Bear baiting was prohibited. Horse racing, gambling, cockfighting were banned or curtailed. Even the maypoles that had stood in village greens for generations were, in many places, cut down. Was this tyranny? Was it government? Or was it, as Cromwell would have said, the plain duty of a ruler before God to govern not merely the bodies of his subjects, but the condition of their souls? The answer depended on who you asked. To his supporters it was righteous governance. To everyone else, a substantial proportion of England, it was an insufferable intrusion into ordinary life. A man who had fought a war for liberty had built a government that told that same man how to live it. The contradiction was not lost on contemporaries, and it was not lost, in his darker hours, on Cromwell himself, because the darker hours came. The nation was restless. Parliament still contested his authority. The Royalists never stopped plotting. The Radicals, the Levelers crushed, the Fifth Monarchists suppressed, the Quakers imprisoned had not been persuaded, merely silenced. And silence is not consent. By 1657 and into 1658. Cromwell's intelligence network, run by his secretary John Thurlow, was intercepting plot after plot. Royalist conspiracies moved through the coffee houses and across the Channel. Twice, perhaps 3 times, credible assassination attempts were uncovered in time. Each time the machinery of the state ground through its work, and each time he added another layer to his isolation. He moved between palaces with unpredictable routes. He wore concealed armor beneath his clothing. He trusted fewer men each year. He slept with pistols beside him. The man who had led charges at Marston Moor and Worcester, with something close to recklessness, had become a man who calculated every doorway. And beneath the paranoia, the body was beginning to fail. He suffered from recurrent malarial fevers, from kidney stones, from some deeper wasting the physicians could name only vaguely. By the summer of 1658, the accumulation of illness and grief, he was 58, had reduced him visibly. Those who saw him described the man diminished, slower, quieter, the eyes still clear, the conviction still present, but the body retreating from the force of will it had served so long. Then his daughter died, Elizabeth Claypole. His favorite child died in August of 1658 after a long and painful illness. Those who were there said her death broke something in him that no battle had broken. He sat at her bedside through her final days and left them changed. A man who had watched thousands of men die on fields he had ordered them to cross could not watch the death of his daughter without being undone. He was already ill. He became more ill. The fever worsened. The physicians gathered. The prayers intensified. On the 3rd of September, 1658, the anniversary of his greatest victories at Worcester and Dunbar, a date he had always called his fortunate day, a storm of extraordinary violence moved across England. Trees were uprooted. Ships were driven onto rocks in the Channel. And in the middle of that storm, in the early afternoon, Oliver Cromwell died. He was 59 years old. The state funeral was elaborate, modeled on the funerals of the monarchs he had displaced. The effigy was displayed at Somerset House for weeks. The procession through London was lined with soldiers. He was buried in Westminster Abbey among kings in Henry VII's chapel. The grief of those who had followed him was genuine. It lasted less than 2 years. Richard Cromwell, the gentle son, inherited the protectorate and lost it within 8 months. The army withdrew its confidence. Parliament reasserted itself. And when it became clear that nothing within England's turbulent politics could produce stability, the invitation went out to the young man in exile. Charles II landed at Dover in May of 1660 to scenes of celebration that observers found frankly astonishing. England, it appeared, had been waiting. The Restoration moved quickly to settle its accounts. In January of 1661, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against the regicides. Most were already dead. Oliver Cromwell, however, could not be left undisturbed. He had been the architect of everything. That he had died and been buried with honor was a condition the restored court required to correct. On the 30th of January, 1661, the anniversary of the king's execution, deliberately chosen, the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were exhumed from Westminster Abbey. They were drawn on hurdles to Tyburn, the place of common execution. There the corpses were hanged in their shrouds on the gallows from morning until sunset. Then they were cut down. The head of Oliver Cromwell was severed and placed on a spike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for more than 20 years. exposed to weather and birds until a storm, another storm, as though wind and rain were the preferred medium of historical irony, blew it down. The body was thrown into a pit beneath the gallows. What do we make? In the quiet of the late hour, of a life that ended twice? Once in a storm in September, surrounded by weeping men and a nation that did not yet know what it would do without him. And once on a gallows at Tyburn, in the cold theater of posthumous vengeance, before a crowd asked to cheer Oliver Cromwell, was born the son of a modest gentleman in Huntingdon. He found God in his 30s and war in his 40s. He built an army from farmers and craftsmen and rode it through the defining conflict of his century. He ended the reign of an anointed king and held the headsman's acts accountable to a written legal process. He governed England for 9 years, improved its navy, secured its borders, crushed Ireland with a ferocity that has not been forgotten, and gave Protestant dissenters protection they had not previously enjoyed. He refused a crown and wielded all of its power. History has never agreed on what to call him: tyrant, liberator, military genius, Puritan fanatic, reluctant revolutionary. The verdict shifts with the century that issues it. In Ireland, the name has never lost its darker meaning and likely never will. He remains, across nearly 4 centuries, a figure who resists simplification, a man of genuine faith and genuine ruthlessness, of deep tenderness and calculated violence, of democratic instinct and authoritarian reflex. He is, in the end, irreducibly complicated, which is perhaps the most honest thing history produces. Not saints, not monsters, men at the intersection of conviction and circumstance, doing what they believed they had to do, leaving behind a world that was not quite what they had imagined. The storm that killed him moved on, as storms do out over the sea. The spike above Westminster Hall held its silent tenant for 20 years, and England became slowly and imperfectly the country it was going to be. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day.